Welcome to the Middlesex Moments Radio Show. I'm Dr. Anna Wasesha, president of Middlesex Community College. Joining me today are my guests from a previous show, Victor Triay, who teaches history here at the college, and Carlos Eire, who teaches history and religion at Yale. But what we're doing is continuing a conversation we had about Cuba. The last time we were talking about this, there was this tumultuous revolution in Cuba in 1956. Am I right
Began
about that?
56, and it took over 59.
In 59.
January
New Year's
1st.
Day. New Year's Day,
Year's Day.
1959.
And I was spoken briefly about the refugee communities who I knew best by living in Minnesota, and that was the Hmong community, who, when they moved to, many of them came to Minnesota and Wisconsin, they really didn't think that they were ever going to return home. A second really large refugee community was Equatorial African, and especially Somalian. And honestly, I will say, and I, with enough experience to be able to feel confident about it, that most of them really do plan to return to Somalia when a government is restored there. So, and then some of you know that my husband teaches history of Taiwan. Taiwan's an island nation that was first colonized by the Japanese, colonized them by the Kuomintang Party that came in, the KMT, in 1949 in their revolution. And now there's a whole question about whether or not they'll be just absorbed into the mainland or be able to be independent. So, in that context of refugee communities and island nations, what's Cuba today? Where's Cuba?
As far as people going back, I mean, I was born in this country, not in Cuba, but I was raised in the exile community, right? I mean, my whole upbringing was in Miami. My parents weren't, political fanatics or anything, but it's just the community. I think there was always the idea in the back of people's heads, even if they say they won't go back, that they are going back. And certainly there are those who are passionate about going back, for sure. I think everybody came with the intention of going back. I think everybody we're coming for a few months because the United States is not going to allow a Soviet, aircraft carrier 90 miles from the United States, called Cuba. So there was always that myth of the 90 miles. And so I think initially everybody came with the intention of going back. Here you were talking about ordinary people with no connection to politics at all. When people who were against Batista left, who incidentally 90% of them became anti-Castro later, it was people who were in the political circles. It didn't involve the guy who was the lawyer, the guy who was the bus driver, or whatever. Now it did. But I think everybody came with the idea of going back, and then eventually many people just said, well, there's no going back, and other people always held out hope.
I'm afraid we have to take a break, and we'll be right back. We're back. This is the Middlesex Moments Radio Show, and today I'm talking with Victor Triay and Carlos Eire about Cuba. It's an immensely important thing for Americans to understand. But what we were kind of getting to before the break was that so much time has passed, and the experience of so many people of Cuba has changed, and the generations have changed. But I mean, the people who are our generation have one thought about Cuba, but Cuba is still alive. It's still a society, and it's.
I left when I was 11. I left as a boy. But now I am a member of a very small minority who can actually remember what Cuba was like before the revolution, right?
Right.
So the memory keeps shrinking of what Cuba used to be like. And since 1992, when President Clinton made an agreement with the Cuban government about immigration, it's been a steady flow every year, 20, 30,000 per year since 1992. It's now amounts to a huge segment of the exile population, especially in Miami. People who were born after the revolution, who never knew anything else, and their take on just about everything is very different. And a large number of, especially the most recent immigrants, now with President Obama, who changed the law and allows people to go back and visit their family. Hundreds of thousands of Cubans in exile visit their relatives, and they bring goods with them. Not only that, they send money to their family in Cuba. And
the dollar was legalized in the 1990s after the fall of the Soviet Union.
Okay, so that's their currency. So a dollar's a dollar. So you can bring in bags of dollars?
You can remit
they would
money.
love that.
Yeah, you can remit, you can send money. And last year, $2.5 billion were sent. $2.5 billion.
An unfathomable size.
And the government takes a good cut of every dollar.
Oh,
sent.
sure.
Yes.
But even what you buy there, it ends up in the government's pocket. So,
the government owns
is,
everything.
Yeah.
The government owns absolutely everything.
Yeah. Recently, they started allowing, simply because it was unsustainable. I mean, everybody works for the government. And finally, they realized, I think Raul Castro said that there's no country in the world where people earn their living by working less than in Cuba. Because, nothing works. And so a lot of people don't even go to work. They get paid or they go to work, they sit around chit-chat for a little while. And he actually let go of hundreds of thousands of state workers. And what he wants now, how's this for a brilliant idea? Something revolutionary, allow people to go out, buy and sell goods, and then have them pay taxes to fund the government. How revolutionary is that?
Yeah.
It only took them 54 years to figure that out, but it's all very controlled.
Yeah.
It's small state-controlled, capitalist experimentation, because they went around the full circle. They realized none of what they were doing had ever worked. They've been being subsidized from day one, first from the Soviet Union, now from Venezuelan and Cubans in the United States who were sending money over there. It was unsustainable.
Well, it's I just read an article about agriculture in Cuba and the constraints on the growers.
Right.
Did you
This is
read
in
the same
Times
article?
yesterday,
Yeah,
yes,
right.
yeah.
And I mean, their trucks are 30
That's
euros,
right.
and the farm implements are Russian, and they break down, and the roads are no good.
More than that, even though you're allowed to, farm your own little plot of land, they have all kinds of rules that you have to follow, and officials who oversee
Right.
everything.
They belong to a cooperative.
And the corruption is endemic. You want to get along with these officials, you have to give them something. So it's not just the fact they don't have farm implements and they don't have gasoline to run the farm implements. It's the fact that even when you're allowed room to grow your own stuff and sell it yourself, there are two things that happen. One is this tightly controlled system that hems you in, and the officials you have to pay off. And the second is you get taxed on that. You get taxed at an inordinately high rate, so that the amount of work you put in doesn't always pay off. As a matter of fact, you might end up in the loss column
Exactly.
rather than the profit column. So
Right.
They make it negative. And there was a time earlier when Fidel was still running the show where they allowed people to put up small businesses in their houses, fixing bicycles or things like that. And then they actually accumulated a little bit of, I wouldn't call it wealth, but money. And then he said, we're not doing this anymore, and actually confiscated a lot of the money that was made for the government. And so, you never know, because even if you open one of these small businesses they're allowing, you're doing it because the government allows it, right? It's not seen as a natural right. And just as they allow it, they can disallow it tomorrow, and you never know. I mean, they'll do it so long as it benefits them. And they have many things in Cuba that have become legal that you would have gone to prison for before, like exchanging goods for money, or having dollars, or communicating with relatives in the United States. I mean, through the 1970s, if you had relatives in the United States and in exile, you kept it quiet. You didn't tell anybody, because that would already be used against you. That would be a black mark on you. And when the economy went bad in the late 70s, Castro all of a sudden promoted the idea of families come visit, and some families have been separated for 20 years, and we're talking about parents and children and whatnot. And a lot of them went. And of course, when you went to Cuba, you had to pay for the hotel 3 times the price, whether you stayed in it or not. You had to get a hotel reservation and pay for it. And so they milked you for everything. But the people there were very much exposed to the bubble they'd been living in for all these years, which prompted protests, and it prompted a lot of people breaking into embassies, which all of that led to the Mario boat lift. And really, I mean, after that, it just, there was not a change in policy, it was a forced change in policy. 10 years later, the Soviet Union falls. They're out of money. And so, if you had dollars before, you went to prison. Now, all of a sudden, they legalized the dollar. And then in 1994, simultaneous to that, Castro turned his back on anybody leaving Cuba who wanted to leave in the middle of the economic crisis. I think it was like 50-some thousand Cubans fled on rafts, came to the United States. The government turned their back, knowing that these people still had close connections on the island. And one of the first things they would do when they had a paycheck was to send part of it to their relatives in Cuba, who would have to buy it at the government-owned stores, and it was a source of income for the government. So there's always a scam. There's a scam at every level. There's a scam at the lowest level with the officials, like Carlos was saying, to scamming all the way to the top of the system. I mean, it is decided that from top to bottom is scamming at one level or another. It's amazing what's happened. I mean, Cuba was always at or near the top in every standard of living indicator that existed, and in some cases even, and this is a Caribbean nation, not just a Latin American, but a Caribbean, even exceeding Portugal and Spain and Italy in many of those in the 1950s in many of those categories, and it's just such a shame.
It is now a third world country,
Right.
and not just a third world country, but one of the poorest on earth. The established salary for every Cuban worker is $18 a month.
Yeah.
That's it. That's all, and you have to make do with that. So that in Cuba, still I have an uncle who lives there, and I've talked to him many times. One time he said, one of the biggest changes here is that the verb to steal, robar, no longer exists. And he said, it's a philosophical question, if there is no private property, can you steal? If everything belongs to the people. So the people say, resolví mi problema.
Right.
I solved my problem.
Yeah.
Is what you say. I solved my problem. Well, I got a gallon of paint. How'd you get it? I solved my problem.
Right.
Yeah,
right,
yeah. This is like
It's a
they
synonym
liberated
now.
it.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. We brought up the other day, something else since 1959 that struck me because I'm researching a book on the Mariel boat lift. That how many Cubans have been through camps of one form or another since 1959? You had the Bay of Pigs guys who were in training camps. You had the Pedro Pan kids who were in transit camps. You had the Mariel boat lift people who were in camps. You had the kids being sent to the countryside to forced labor for the state who were in camps. I don't think there's been a population on Earth that has been part of camps more than the Cuban population since 1959. A society of camps. I mean, it's an amazing and very tragic
And
it's
thing.
incredibly tragic.
We may be on the verge of another great outflow of people from Cuba because
why?
Raul Castro announced that the migration laws are going to change in 2013, and more people are going to be allowed to leave. So what everyone's trying to guess is, where are these people going to go? Who's going to take them in?
Right.
And there's speculation, I think, very, very real possibility that there will be another kind of Mariel boat lift explosion coming to the United States.
Right, and directly or indirectly,
Right.
because technically now after 54 years you're allowed to leave the country. You don't see a lot of Cuban tour groups in Rome and in Paris and stuff because you're not allowed to travel except under very special conditions. They're saying you can leave, but there has to be a country that'll take you. So even if the United States limits its quota, right, the current law, the way it reads, that if they catch a Cuban on the high seas, they could send you back, as is Bill Clinton. Before, they would take everybody. But if you somehow make it to the United States, even if it's undetected, when you put your feet on U.S. territory, you immediately receive asylum. So say, I don't know, Colombia says we'll take 10,000 Cubans a year. Well, they're going to easily somehow come to the United States. All I have to do is get on an airplane or somehow, and once you touch here, you're given. So eventually, there's going to be, I think, most of those people will end up, because most of them have family here, they have relatives, and Miami is, the capital of Cuba practically.
I know.
Now it's the capital of a lot of Latin American countries besides Cubans, but there's an economy there, and a very prosperous economy there that includes huge Cuban-owned enterprises, small Cuban-owned businesses, Cuban professionals. There's a place for them, more than anywhere else on Earth. So they'll probably end up there. And you're right. We're talking about a large number of people.
And they've made it clear that they're not going to allow professionals to leave. People that the state has invested in are not going to get the same permission as others. So a large part of this migration is going to be unskilled labor.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, if a person's educated in communist Cuba, they make it sound like they did you a favor, right? We educated you. You should show your gratitude by staying here and using your skills here. Of course, what the other side of the coin is because no one else was allowed to educate me. The state monopolized education. It isn't because other individuals aren't capable of educating you, but I didn't have a choice.
Well, we have to take a break, but then so I'm going to say my question now because I tend to forget it when we talk over the break, which is clearly the medical system in Cuba, at least from various things that I read, they run hospitals, they must do surgery, so there must be scientists and professionals. How do they tolerate living in kind of Cuban society at that time? So, so we'll take a break. Well, welcome back. This is the Middlesex Moments radio show, and I'm so happy to be able to have this extended conversation with Victor Triay and Carlos Eire about Cuba. So my question before the break had been, that I know that there's a professional class in Cuba because I read about them. You see evidence of them, even in Michael Moore's documentary where he took the people from 9/11 down there.
Michael Moore, by the way, blames every problem the United States has had since 1960 on Cuban exiles. There's a whole chapter in one of his books devoted to Cuban exiles. Everything. I mean, there isn't a major national problem in the United States that he doesn't somehow trace back to Cuban exiles.
And the hospital he took those people to was the Communist Party hospital.
Oh,
it was the best hospital.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, for foreigners and for top-level people, yeah.
But, we live in 1956 to 59, you wrote letters to people on that little blue paper, the overseas paper, and you hoped that it would arrive. Today, everything is interconnected. So this group of people, well-educated people in Cuba, they must see a world that maybe is preferable to the one they lived in.
Certainly. Well, I mean, first of all, I think that until recently, they've been more cut off than we would assume. I mean, I've met a lot of people who are professionals, then until the late 70s, they were so blocked off from. I mean, if you had family in the United States, you wouldn't even call them because they monitor the calls. You didn't want to get yourself into trouble. It was a bubble. I mean, it was like living inside a steel coffin. But even later, those who wanted to leave, you could falsify documents. My father-in-law left in 1981, falsifying documents. Fortunately, communism is very inefficient, and as long as everything has the right signature on it, right, you're fine. But I've met a lot of people who had a position that they wouldn't have been able to leave because of that position. So a lot of people, and you saw this in the Mario boat lift, and you saw this later, in anticipation of their departure, they know for some reason that their number is going to come up, either because of the Mario boat lift or whatever. They actually would have themselves demoted, right, to a lower position, work in that for X number of months, so that when they apply to leave, they're not leaving as a person of this status, they're leaving as a person of a lower status professionally. And so that's one way that they've been able to get around it. And of course, there have been chaotic moments when they've left. There have been, of course, raft people. But, a lot of these poor, desperate raft people that you see, some of them might be professionals. They just look that way because they've been on a raft in the Florida Straits for 10 days, with a 1 day worth of water or something. So there are a lot of ways. But, again, people know how to scam. People know who to pay. So there's always, not always, but there's often a way. During the Mario boat lift, a lot of them got out. Or, some who are sent overseas. The number of people who defect while overseas is enormous. Which is why is one reason why you still got Cubans, all over Europe, because they're sending them to Bulgaria, and their plane touched down in Paris, and they run off the plane in Paris and call the U.S. embassy and say, I want. This is all before the mid-'90s. So yeah, a lot of them will find a way to come, but legally, getting the exit documents will be a lot more difficult.
And this is one reason they don't allow professionals such as doctors to travel with their families when they're sent overseas, is they keep their families at home. So you're separated from your family, makes you think twice or three times about defecting because you'll be separated from your family. But professionals in Cuba are not as connected to the world as one would think, though, because only about 1.5% of the population in Cuba has access to the internet.
Really?
Yes, only 1.5%, and that's a
remarkable.
tall figure. That's an inflated figure probably. It's very and if you're in Cuba, unless you're in a foreign embassy or in certain hotels, do you actually have access to the internet. In Cuba, what they have is what they have in China. They have an intranet where everything is very carefully censored. So when they teach students in school about the internet, what they're really getting access to is the intranet,
Right.
where everything is
Right.
monitored.
Right. And there are some dissidents who have blogs,
Right.
but they're in the position where they've gotten international recognition. And so, if somehow someone from Human Rights Watch or something knows who you are, they're going to know if you go to prison. And the Cuban government has to measure, and this has been the case since the start of the human rights movement in Cuba, and the dissident movement in Cuba, which goes back to the late 70s, early 80s, that, once you've got the human rights organizations having recognized you, then the government has to measure, is it worth arresting him? What's more damaging to us? To let them keep going with their propaganda, their little blog, whatever, or the price we're going to have to pay internationally if we put him in prison, because now the whole world will know, which is amazing because in the 1960s and 70s, when none of the human rights organizations cared about Cuba, because they only cared about right-wing oppressors, they didn't, think that, even including Amnesty International, that it finally took a few decades for these groups even to acknowledge that there was a problem there. So now, you got Ioannis Sanchez and other people who blog, and they'll go to some tourist internet cafes, wherever it is they could do it, and start writing. But the Cuban government has to tolerate them, because now if they arrest somebody like that, there are millions of people around the world who would know, and they'll start asking
Right.
questions.
And they arrest them regularly.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, for a day or two. They
For a day
arrest
or
them.
two.
Yeah, they detain them overnight or for a day or maybe
Right.
almost 2 days, and
Yeah.
then they release them. They harass them
Yeah.
continually.
Or sometimes more. I mean, there's a group, and if you're really causing them damage, and then you'll end up dead. And I say end up dead because now they can't carry out the mass executions like they used to. So now, you had this group, Women in White, who are the wives and sisters, etc., of 75 dissidents arrested several years ago, and they march every Sunday, all dressed in white with flowers from St. Rita Church in Havana to I'm not sure where, and the leader of that group suddenly took ill and then suddenly died in the hospital of unknown causes. You have another dissident who they allowed to starve to death in prison. This was, I think, last year or the year before Tamayo, and then just this year in July, and I remember it was July because I was coming back from a Yankee game, on the Metro North train when I got the news of it. Osvaldo Payas Sardinas, who's a Catholic activist and a human rights worker, he was with someone else in his group, along with a Spaniard, a young Spaniard and a young Swede, who'd gone there to help the human rights groups in Cuba. And there was a mysterious car accident in which Payas died, and they arrested the Swede and the Spaniard. They let the Swede go. He hasn't said a word.
The other Cuban died too.
And the other Cuban died. And then the Spaniard was actually arrested and I think given a prison term for
he's
reckless driving or something. But, Payas ended up dead, which is what they wanted. So, you've got those sorts of things that happen to the human rights workers there regularly. And I believe today is International Human Rights Day, isn't it? December 10th.
And yesterday they
wow.
arrested over 100 ladies in white throughout the entire island.
Mm.
In Havana alone, at St. Rita Church, they arrested 44 women.
So why? I mean, they seem like, as an outsider and not a student of Cuba at all. I mean, Fidel Castro is alive but not doing anything. Raúl doesn't seem like he's the charismatic leader to take his brother's place. The United States is filled with powerful Latino, Hispanic leaders, and the world is very interconnected. So, and they're operating like a little like North Korea, it's like a little hermit kingdom there. So, why aren't they in danger of another kind of revolution, or are they?
Oh.
Control. It's very hard for people who live in a free society to imagine what it's like to live in a totalitarian state, where you fear at every turn you have to end up in prison.
Sure.
Or what they do is they send your neighbors to harass you.
Torment
how
you.
do they get your neighbors to, how they call them popular response brigades?
Right.
The people who, every single block in Cuba,
CDR.
town or city, there is a spy house.
Committee for the Defense of the
Committee
Revolution.
for the Defense of the Revolution. They're the ones who control the ration books for everyone in the neighborhood.
And
They
they're
spy on
watchdog
you.
groups. They keep an eye on you.
And they know, they say, well, we need to go to so-and-so's house, yell at them and throw dog excrement and break their windows and so on. If you don't go, the CDR marks you down as not cooperating, which means that you now get on the list of
You're
the
under
bad
suspicion.
people. So it's very hard to understand if you live in a free society how that system works. But you have to think of the government in Cuba more as the mafia or a criminal organization than as a state, because the people at the very top profit off of everybody else's labor, and they live very well. They live by a different set of rules. And Forbes magazine for the past decade or so has included the Castro brothers on their list of the wealthiest people on earth. They have billions stashed away in bank accounts throughout the world. And in the past few years, the younger Castro family, the sons and grandsons and granddaughters, have been buying up land in South America and other places like crazy.
And they own resorts in Europe and the whole thing. Yeah, that's the biggest thing. Yeah, I mean, there's capitalism in Cuba, but it's all in the hands of the Castro clan, which turned the island into their, personal property and their personal
It's run by
ranch.
the military. The all tourism in Cuba, every dollar or euro that goes into the economy in Cuba through tourism is funneled through the military, because the military run the Ministry of Tourism. That's what most people who are tourists in Cuba don't understand, is that everything they spend in Cuba, a good part of it goes to the military, who are the ruling elites. It's an old-fashioned, this is the great irony of the so-called revolution. It's an old-fashioned Latin American military junta that talks a lot about social justice. They promote their so-called free health care and free education. It's a cover. It's a cover for running one of the largest criminal operations. It's a slave plantation, really. My definition of slavery is that you work and somebody else gets your pay. That's what happens in Cuba. At the tourist hotels that are owned by Europeans, they're all owned by Europeans.
49%.
49%, right, I'm sorry. But they have to pay their employees European wages, right? So let's say I'm Jose Sanchez working at one of these hotels. The hotel company, Meliá in Spain, is paying me European wages, let's say.
On paper.
On paper, $12 an hour. I get $18 a month.
Yeah.
The
Right, because
Ministry of Tourism
right,
gets the
right,
rest of the money.
right. They pay the government ministry, and then the government ministry pays the worker, but
Right.
they'll throw them a few coins. So I mean, most of the workers work there because you can steal stuff, soap and
Sure.
towels.
It's
Sure,
the best
the
job. It's the best
underground-
job on the island.
Underground economy. I'm afraid we've run out
Oh.
of time again.
Oh my.
It's,
Okay.
it's not fair.
That's right. Well, we'll do it again.
Yeah, we will
next
do it
semester.
again. We will. Well, I want to thank you both for being here today, Carlos Eire and, of course, Victor Triay, who's teaching a course during the interim. This is the
Yes, intercession, right. 3
Almost.
credits in 3 weeks.
Well, yeah, that's right. That's the way to do it. Although it'd be also fun to be in a class with you for a whole semester. This has been the Middlesex Moments radio show, and I'm Anna Wasesha, president of Middlesex Community College, wishing you a good day.